Introduction of our speaker, Frances Widdowson. Lloyd, could you please introduce?
I certainly could. It's my pleasure to introduce Frances. I got to know her a couple of years ago when she interviewed me for her podcast series for Woke Academy. I had, of course, known about Frances many years prior. She co-authored, and it's already been her book, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, The Deception Behind Indigenous Cultural Preservation. She wrote that in 2008. In 2013, she authored Native Studies and Canadian Political Science, The Implications of Decolonizing the Discipline. And she co-authored Running the Gauntlet, Challenging the Taboo, Obstructing Aboriginal Education Policy Development. In 2023, she contributed a book chapter, Billy Remembers, to the book Grave Error. And I'm sure she'll be mentioning some information from that book chapter in her talk today. Frances Widdowson initially kept her job. Hey, these titles I just gave you show a bit of controversy, right? She kept her job as a tenured professor despite challenging prevailing narratives, but after defending former C.B.C reporter Wendy Mesley for uttering the name of a book written by Quebec separatist Pierre Valliere, and after asking questions about purported mass graves at Indian residential schools, she discovered the limits of tenure at Canadian universities. That led to a legal action. I believe she was successful. Enlightenment. The Enlightenment pushes limits. Indeed, free speech demands it. It is my pleasure then to welcome a pusher of limits and an advocate for freedom's free speech, Frances.
Anyway, thank you very much for your kind words, Lloyd. I should mention that the Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry was co-authored with Albert Howard, who I co-authored many other pieces with, including a edited volume on Aboriginal education in Canada with a number of contributors in that volume. And I'm very pleased to be here looking at the question of the Enlightenment, the importance of the Enlightenment, which I think is an incredibly important topic. And I was just talking to Albert a couple hours ago, and he was sort of saying, well, obviously it's important. Who could object to that? The Enlightenment. Well, I know a lot of people who would object to the Enlightenment, the pursuit of a universal truth, all these kinds of ideas. So I think that there is a large element in universities that take issue with the Enlightenment, which I'll talk about when I talk about the threats to the Enlightenment. Anyway, I have firsthand experience with this myself, the threats to the Enlightenment. I guess I'm somewhat of a victim of that. I fought hard in the university I was in the university system for, I guess, 25 years. And everything was not exactly easy. But in 2020, everything fell apart. And the Enlightenment really, the values of the Enlightenment really are not in existence anymore at the university. And that's my main experience with this. And I want to talk a bit at the end about the universities, what's happened to the universities and how the Enlightenment doesn't really, is not really the framework anymore of most universities in all likelihood. My case at Mount Royal, I don't think Mount Royal University is all that unusual in terms of universities. And in terms of where my situation is right now, I was fired in 2021 as Lloyd. The catalyst was the defense of Pierre Valliere's book, White Niggers of America. I have no hesitation in saying that book title. It is a hill I will die on. Valliere was using that title, developed that title for an anti-racist purpose, to say that denigration that happens of groups is if they're being racially denigrated, this is not generally due to race, it's due to their class position. That's what he was trying to draw attention to. And that book title has tremendous rhetorical force in English, and they are not going to allow me to censor Pierre Valliere. I'm not going to do it. And I will, unless you put a gun to my head, then I will, maybe we can talk about it. But until that time, I've had enough of this. And this is nonsense. And the fact that people are not standing up to it. And the worst part of it is that in terms of my case, the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which is the union that is representing all faculty associations, they fortunately took over my case. So we had expertise from the national organization, because my union is absolutely treacherous, absolutely treacherous. But the Canadian Association of University Teachers, on its brief defending me, would not spell out the book title. And I said to them, you have to spell out the book title. What does that mean? That the union of all unions for academic freedom will not do that. And they refuse to do it. And so this is where we're at. The idiocy that we have to deal with on a daily basis in the university system. Anyway, it's a long and tragic story, which is covered on the website www.wokeacademy.info if you would like more information on that. And my case was, quote unquote, won, in the sense that I was found to have been wrongfully terminated, but I could not be reinstated. So I lost on that, because Gabrielle Weaselhead, the Indigenous scholar activist, doesn't feel safe with me criticizing Indigenous science at Mount Royal. And so therefore the friction that is involved in me returning, the arbitrator stated cannot allow me to return. That is being appealed to the Alberta Labor Relations Board, as well as other matters. Anyway, so that's going to be happening over the next, hopefully we're going to the Supreme Court of Canada on this one. That's my hope. So I'm ready for the long fight, and I will not give them 1,000th of an inch on any of this. This is absolutely terrible what has happened, and the fact that there's not like a national outcry about that situation that occurred at Mount Royal University is a bit of an indication of what's happening, and the complete destruction of Enlightenment values in the university system. And I'll talk about that more in the end. But before I get into all those kind of circumstances which are related to the universities, I wanted to give a bit of a background on the Enlightenment. And probably most, I would imagine everyone on this Zoom event is very familiar with this. This is going to be retreading old ground, but many people who watch the video might not be aware of the Enlightenment, and it's good just to remind ourselves of some of the important principles that are at stake, and how the Enlightenment developed. The threats to the Enlightenment, there are many threats to the Enlightenment, and I probably haven't covered every single threat that exists, but I think I've touched on most of the threats, the main threats, and I wanted to go over those. And then I wanted to get a bit into the university system, because, you know, universities were one of the major accomplishments of the Enlightenment, the modern university. And to see the universities in such a terrible state is really distressing. And it's important in terms of the truth, the pursuit of truth, and the kind of knowledge that we can develop as a species. But it also has important consequences for policy development. So people who think that the universities are just some kind of esoteric entity that don't really have any connection to the real world, this is a huge mistake to think in those terms, because the knowledge that, or lack of, that is produced in the universities shapes how policies are formulated and developed. And what's happening now is there's a number of policy areas which really are seriously compromised because of the destruction of the pursuit of truth in the university system. And I just wanted to briefly touch upon a few of these areas, some of the most hot button topics that two of them I have had intense interaction with, which are indigenization and trans activism. That's the other one that got me into hot water. But the Israel-Palestine conflict is also a very serious issue that deserves a lot of scrutiny. And that is a very dangerous subject in the universities today. And I just wanted to briefly, and from my own perspective, it's an interesting one, because people who will support you on your stance on trans activism and indigenization will not support you on a stance on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. So there's often a split in terms of the supposed supporters of academic freedom along political lines. And that's something that's very interesting to examine as well. So the Enlightenment. So I just kind of took a screenshot of Encyclopedia Britannica's outline of what it sees the Enlightenment as. It's a particular period, a particular historical period, the 17th and the 18th centuries. And there's a number of related areas that are very significant in terms of the influence that the Enlightenment had on them. And I just saw a very good kind of summary of this on the Stanford University website. And it was the true, the good, and the beautiful, those three areas. So knowledge, science, and arts, the arts. There's a massive influence of the Enlightenment. And often the Enlightenment is referred to as the Age of Reason. So it intersects with the scientific revolution. We often think of the Enlightenment in terms of the philosophy that came out in that time. And something that is shared by all those facets of the Enlightenment, I believe, is the idea of the individual. That's when our understanding of the individual really came to the forefront, was in the Enlightenment, and the idea that through reason, and the Enlightenment is often called the Age of Reason, through our individual reason, relying on that, trying to understand things, we can create a more beautiful and a better world. So we can kind of reshape the nature of our society according to how we think about things and how we take control over our institutions and so on. So I think that's, although that's a bit of a simplification, obviously, as to what the Enlightenment is about, I think that the idea of individuals coming together and using reason to better understand things and through the political process create a better world is some of the fundamental aspects of the Enlightenment. In terms of the development of the Enlightenment, being a historical materialist and looking at the economic factors with respect to the Enlightenment, I think it could be argued, I think that there's a strong argument to be made that the Enlightenment came out of the transition, the economic and political transition that was occurring from a feudal system, which was based upon the ownership of land, a very hierarchical system with, the king at the top and the peasants at the bottom, whereby ownership of land enabled you to extract surplus from the peasants, that kind of system. And of course, the church, the Catholic Church, and the control of the church, control by the church of various facets of society was heavily interconnected into the feudal system. And when the transition was made from feudalism to capitalism, and there's a lot of interesting theories about what led this to happen, a reliance on tradition was no longer enabled the development to occur, the economic and political developments to occur that were unfolding at the time. So this resulted in a freeing up of a number of very restrictive kinds of hierarchical types of institutions. And that's not to say that we got equality out of that, because we still have a class system in capitalism. We still have owners of what's called the means of production, and workers, those who in the historical materialism are the producers of value in society. But there's more mobility and more ability to control things as individuals than would have been the case in the feudal system. So, and the Enlightenment, comes out of that development. Like, it makes sense if you're going to need to try to sell things and change society in terms of your ownership of various economic enterprises, develop markets, and so on, for there to be more freedom of ideas and innovation. It's a much more innovative system, and I think the Enlightenment is connected to that. In addition to there being this transition economically and politically that happened at the time, there was a number of important precursors and events, which I just wanted to just briefly state. The Renaissance, which was in the 1300s, and we often think of the Renaissance in terms of the artistic development. So when I was talking about beauty, conceptions of beauty, and seeing individuals in a new way in terms of the creators of beautiful works of art, there was also important legal developments that were happening in the Renaissance, things that we investigate in political science. So I'm a political scientist, so often we're looking at the political institutions that emerged. And one interesting development that happened was the reintegration of the concept of what's called imperium, which was an aspect of Roman law, which wasn't at the forefront of things in the Middle Ages, which is, it was something that the Romans developed to allow the emperor to control far-flung territories, which is the emperor, although he controls the area, the territory in which he resides, he also controls other territories. And this kind of logic was the basis for the modern state, which is connected to this transitional period from sort of far-flung kind of empires to centralized political authority. And that allows, a prime minister to have a seat in, to have parliament in Ottawa, but just because the prime minister is in Ottawa, that doesn't mean that the laws don't apply to British Columbia and the East Coast. That wasn't something that really was very well understood before the period of the Renaissance and the development of this idea of imperium. And then, of course, we had the Reformation in the 1500s, Martin Luther, and the idea that you didn't need the Pope to interpret, the Catholic Church to interpret the Bible. You could read the Bible for yourself and make your own judgments about it. So the individual, the notion of the individual and the individual interpretation of the Bible, that's very much connected to this development of these kinds of Enlightenment values. And the Enlightenment, as we'll see shortly, is the idea of the separation of church and state, the idea of religious tolerance. That's very much connected to Enlightenment values. And the Reformation was the beginning of that kind of understanding of things, which became so central to many Enlightenment figures. And then finally, we have the three revolutions, which emerged out of these developments, and also were shaped by the philosophy of the Enlightenment. And that, of course, is the English Revolution, or what's called the Glorious Revolution in 1688, whereby you had Parliament being a higher authority than the king, or the king being accountable to Parliament. That was really the beginnings of serious controls over the monarchy. And then we have the American Revolution, which was about getting rid of colonial controls. And then the French Revolution, liberty, fraternity, equality, and those kinds of aspirations. The aspirations of individuals using reason to be able to control their destiny was very much, part of revolutionary thinking and revolutionary action. And of course, the aftermath of, especially of the French Revolution, resulted in a sort of counter Enlightenment kind of period, and concerns that, is this really, are we on the right track? Wanting humans to, remake society. Does that get rid of some of the glue that has been built up for thousands of years that we're just kind of tearing away, and then the possible terrible consequences? So a lot of debates came out of the consequences of these revolutions as well. So that's kind of, I know that's a simplification, but it gives us a bit of a sense of the historical process and the ideas that were shaping these kinds of developments, which were happening, between the 1600s and the 1800s. And I believe 1810 is seen as the end of the Enlightenment period, and that was the death of Immanuel Kant, was 1810. So that gives you a bit of an understanding of the period that we're talking about. But some would say the Enlightenment is not a period. The Enlightenment is a set of values that can happen at any time. But the idea is that they came into effect initially during this period. So in terms of summarizing the Enlightenment, the major concerns, I didn't have beauty in here. I should have maybe had a section on beauty, but as I'm a political economist, it's not an area that I study very well, but it would be interesting to see how the Enlightenment intersected with art, the developments of art that happened. But I'm focusing here on area of knowledge and the area of politics. So the idea, the concern, first and foremost, the age of reason, is that, you shouldn't rely on tradition or revelation. You should rely on your mind and the thought processes, the methodologies for an understanding of the world and pursuit of truth. And this is going to come up more when I look at the threats. This was a universal. So we're seeing now, and this is, I have had a lot of experience with this, where, people talk about truth, and truth doesn't mean what it used to mean when people are talking about truth now in the universities. They're not talking about a universal. They seem to be talking about, if you believe it's true, it's true. And not everyone has that capacity. It's certain groups that have their own truth, these sorts of things. That is very anti-Enlightenment thinking, to have this kind of subjective view of truth. And then being able to use our faculties of reason to be able to figure out things is very much in evidence with respect to how politics is discussed. And you're not going to go in the Enlightenment and sort of the promotion of Enlightenment values. You're not going to go with what's happened in the past just because it happened in the past. Now, you might decide to go with what happens in the past and to retain that, but you're going to do that because you've evaluated whether there's evidence to support that creating a better world. So it's not necessarily anti-tradition, but the way in which it would evaluate whether or not tradition should be followed would be very much different than what you would see in pre-Enlightenment types of arguments. Religion, the attitude towards religion is very different in the Enlightenment. And this is an interesting question in terms of investigating the Enlightenment. It's not that the Enlightenment thinkers were atheists, although they might have been. And perhaps one could argue that the Enlightenment results in atheism becoming more prominent. It's more that religion shouldn't be the official doctrine, like it shouldn't be imposed upon the population, and therefore you should tolerate the fact that people have different beliefs, religious beliefs than you do. And of course, this was not in operation in the pre-Enlightenment period. In fact, it was very, very dangerous for you to espouse ideas that were contrary to the dominant religion. So that's the first thing, is the tolerance, the idea of tolerance, and then the idea that the state should not have a religious position, that the state should really remain neutral in matters of religion. And religion became more and more of a private matter, something that you held yourself and that you practiced in your own way. That was basically some of the developments. And then in terms of the justification of state action, so through most of human history, the justification was tradition. So if you didn't have violence, that is. So, there's always violence, but if you were to have a political system that would change from one figure to another, it would be tradition that would justify that. And that's sort of the idea of the divine right of kings and the various hereditary forms of leadership. With the Enlightenment, there was a challenge to that that kind of traditional form of authority, and how you would justify state power would be consent. So, and this is sort of the foundations of many, many democratic theories. And we had, in the period of the Enlightenment, the emergence of what was called contract theorists. And those would be Locke, John Locke, Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which were talking about how you would allow the state to coerce you, like you would consent to it if you got some protections, if you would be protected in various ways. And it was kind of conceptualized differently according to the thinkers, but they were trying to, sort of put forward a justification for state authority that was different than heredity. And because you're consenting to it, you would have a lot of the idea of the Enlightenment would come in, and that you would need to discuss things, and you should have open discussion about what should be consented to, what was the legitimate kinds of areas of which you would consent to, and so on. So that's very much at the basis of trying to create a better world, is to be able to persuade people to pursue a particular course of action, and then have them consent to that. And that's if you take political theory, you study all the contract theorists. Okay, so that gives us a bit of a background to the Enlightenment, the kinds of concerns that existed in that period, and as well continue to shape our values, our Enlightenment values. And, we are the new Enlightenment Project. So this is something that we're very, very interested in carrying forward. I think that we're part of this organization because we all take these Enlightenment values seriously, and the idea that we should be, have open discussion. There shouldn't be attempts to stop people from dissenting and providing critical points of view. And that process, being able to do that, that's the best way for humans to be able to figure out what a better society would look like. And then once we do that, then we can figure out our institutions and how best to bring that into effect. And this is under serious threat. I agree with Richard Dawkins, who would be classified as a major person who espouses Enlightenment values. Some of these are things which were threats at the time and continue to be threats. Conservatism, of course, has always been somewhat suspicious of Enlightenment values because the individual is not really a major part of conservative thought. Conservatism sees society as an organic whole that has different classes taking their proper position within society, and is very nervous about any kind of revolutionary change, because conservatives maintain that, you spent thousands of years building up these institutions which have stood the test of time. And if you're going to have a revolutionary action, then you're going to rip those apart. And conservatives would point to the French Revolution as being a good example of, that's what happens when you rip apart these traditional features that have stood the test of time. You're going to get, the reign of terror, and these kinds of things happen. Anyway, conservatism really values the role that religion plays in an official sense in society, as well as the role that the monarchy plays. And any attempts to bring back religion and the monarchy and hereditary, let's not just say monarchy, let's say hereditary forms of leadership, are a serious threat to the ability of individuals through reason to be able to decide how we should structure our societies. And it's kind of an interesting question as to, what role, should religion, would a society with no religion be more in line with Enlightenment values or is it just about preventing religion from having control over public institutions? That probably would be an interesting debate within people, who are espousing Enlightenment values. And you now even hear some people like James Lindsay, who I think would be consider himself to be an espouser of Enlightenment values, sort of saying that, someone in the beginning was mentioning the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the atheistic thinkers. And I'm an atheist myself, so I tend to think that, religion, it would be a better society if we were able to eliminate religious thinking. But some are arguing now that you can't get rid of religion. It's so hardwired into human kind of ways in which they operate, that if you try to get rid of it, it's replaced by something that's actually worse, which is sort of like the argument about why we're embroiled in this woke kind of climate, which I'll talk about shortly. Anyway, so conservatism's always been a threat to Enlightenment values, in the sense that it thinks that both religion and traditional forms of authority should play a large role in how societies operate. In the Enlightenment period, one of the reactions to the Enlightenment as well was what's called Romanticism, which is a movement about, which is basically a distrust of reason and a promotion of the emotions. So the idea that you should trust your feelings, that's kind of a deeper indication of whether something's right or wrong, is your emotional kind of response, and a kind of a celebration of the subjective over the objective. And it's interesting to think how Romanticism plays a role in society today. Is that what we're seeing as a return of romanticism. Is partly what we're dealing with. Anyway, you can see this often in the arts during the Enlightenment period, but you also saw it in various philosophical writings. Nationalism, which of course in nationalism is that your highest kind of allegiance is to the state. That's the idea of nationalism as an ideology. And because the Enlightenment values the individual, the role that the individual plays, this would be a serious threat. And it is a threat today, definitely, especially when that nationalism is ethnic in nature. So in political science, we have often nationalism is categorized in terms of ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. Civic nationalism is when you have loyalty to the state, but it's based upon your attachment to geographical boundaries, national symbols, and institutions. And something like the United States or Canada would be good examples of the civic model of nationalism. And it doesn't matter what ethnicity that you are in those forms of nationalism. They're made up of many ethnicities. But there are some forms of nationalism where it is your ancestry and various other characteristics attached to your culture or race that forms the basis of the nation. And those tend to be more exclusive than the civic form. And so because of that, they would be seen as especially, kind of contrary to the ideals of the individual. Because in the civic form, you can kind of include more and more individuals into your geographic boundary. You might argue that would still go against the humanistic value of it should be humanity that's valued instead of these state boundaries, but they're seen as being more flexible in terms of who's included in the civic model than the ethnic model. The threat to the Enlightenment, which I think many of us are particularly concerned about right now, is the effect that what's called postmodernism has had on all sorts of institutions. It started in the universities in the 1960s with the assault on the pursuit of truth, the universal pursuit of a universal truth, and the insistence that the subjective should replace the objective in terms of trying to, I don't know if understand is the right word, but to operate in the world. So the relativism that we see, you have your truth, I have my truth, one group has their truth, another group has their truth. That's kind of the postmodern position that took hold in the 1960s. And then over the last 50 years, it's been morphing into equity, diversity, and inclusion ideology and what many call wokeism. And I'm not using wokeism here as a pejorative. And this is a bit of a problem when everyone's accusing people of being woke. It's an actual situation, which is wokeism is about identity politics. So the idea that to empower marginalized groups, their identity should be affirmed, like that's how groups will empower themselves, is through the affirmation of their identity, the pursuit of having their identity affirmed. Wokeism is when that becomes totalitarian, and that's when the state demands that you must affirm an identity. And we see this with demanding that you must call someone who's a sperm producing XY chromosome person a she or a they them, and you've got to do it, otherwise you're going to be hauled before some human rights tribunal. That's wokeism, is when it's a totalitarian demand that you must do that, not the kind of identity politics kind of promotion. And then we have a wider ideological position called equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is everywhere. And that seems to be a combination of wokeism and what's called social equity theory, which you see in the public administration literature that came out in the 60s, I believe. George Fredrickson is the author of that. And that idea is that Fredrickson talked about equal shares. So that's how you bring about a better world, is by giving various groups equal shares of the what's called the administrative state, which is often the bureaucracy, but it can be various professional positions. And that's equity under this social equity literature, is that if you've got 7% of the population is Indigenous, then 7% of all the occupations should also be held by Indigenous people. And because you want to retain those Indigenous people in those positions, you want to ensure that that this diversity is maintained. You need to prevent people from making them feel uncomfortable in their positions. So that's often what the inclusivity is it's not about including everyone, it's about excluding those people who make the maintenance of this diversity uncomfortable. And that I encountered that firsthand at Mount Royal University. The final thing, which I just have a question mark after, is just, capitalism. How does capitalism fit into all this? And this is a big, sort of area of major debate, I would think, in discussions about Enlightenment values. Is capitalism, is it a necessary economic system for Enlightenment values, or is it a threat to Enlightenment values? And that's a very interesting question, which I just wanted to pose. And I've seen arguments on both sides of that question. It's something that perhaps we can get into in the discussion period, but I see that quite a lot when I'm kind of investigating the Enlightenment and the role that it plays in society today. Okay, so what I wanted to end on is just talking about some of my own thoughts about the universities. And this feeds in mostly into wokeism and equity, diversity, and inclusion ideology. Is the universities, which I would argue are one of the major institutions that were made possible. This is the modern university, which is not the university as a training ground for the clergy, which is how universities were originally kind of envisioned. It's, universities as those institutions which allow us to pursue the truth. And often you will see on the modern university on coat of arms, like Harvard, its coat of arms is Veritas, which is the Latin for truth. And that was in place in the universities, the ideal. And it didn't work. And I want to be clear here, is that although universities had that as their ideal, they often failed in numerous ways in this regard, but they still had it as their ideal, that we were all there to, speak freely, speak honestly, try to dispute what others were saying, to figure out what the nature of reality was. That's what we were supposed to be doing, according to the Enlightenment version of the university. Well, that version of the university doesn't exist anymore, which I found out myself, which I saw it was really around 2014, I guess. That's when I knew there was always problems and it wasn't easy to exist. And I wasn't exactly a popular figure in the university, but I was tolerated, and, I had the academic freedom was protecting me. And I had reassurances from administrators that, I didn't need to worry my head about, any kind of attempts to push me out because of all the anger that was being expressed in various moments. But anyway, in getting worse and worse and worse, and from 2014, then 2020 with the George Floyd, the death of George Floyd, it all fell apart. It completely fell apart, the university system. And I noticed this with trans activism. So that's part of my firing for people who don't know that. I satirized an idea called misgendering fatigue. So, and this has got to do with the pronoun stuff. So there was this faculty member whose name is D.A. Dirks who was doing this pronouns workshop where Dirks goes by they, them pronouns, and had this cartoon on misgendering fatigue where there's this character who's got a backpack and they're laying on the floor and they say, it's just so exhausting being misgendered. Every time I misgender, it's like someone puts a brick in my backpack, and at the end of the day, I'm so exhausted, I have to lay down, and that it feels every day. It feels like I'm being crushed by the unending burden of the gender binary. Anyway, I satirized this cartoon and referred to an MRU colleague appears to be suffering from misgendering fatigue. Anyway, that was the iron boot, the iron fist of Mount Royal came down on me for that one. But it's a wider problem than just this kind of thing. What it really is the idea that there are only two sexes is strongly opposed in the universities. And this was brought up in my arbitration hearing when, as to why I couldn't be reinstated. The chair of the sociology and anthropology department, Mary Lee Mulholland, one of her arguments was that I claimed there was only two sexes. So because of that, trans people feel unsafe being in the vicinity of where I am, and therefore they shouldn't be allowed to be at the university. So this is a serious problem that biological sex, which is one of the, it's a fact, is now not able to be expressed, and you're going to have serious problems if you're going to insist on this in the universities. And this has been muddied constantly by this terminology, which is intersex. No one should use that word. It's a disorder of sexual development where you have male and female, but you have developmental disorders on both the female side and the male side. It's not a spectrum where you've got a bunch of intermediary forms in between. Anyway, there's a bunch of people fighting back against this now, but it's still a completely toxic area that is in the university system. And that really is, postmodernism and the destruction of truth has had a major contributing factor to that. Then there's the indigenization. That was the major problems that I had, was with indigenization and the criticism of indigenous science. Gabrielle Weaselhead, who's an indigenous activist. So basically, she feels unsafe if I'm at Mount Royal. So Mount Royal basically decided that I was going to be pushed out. And then a couple months after I left, Weaselhead, who had left because she felt unsafe at me being at Mount Royal, was then hired back at Mount Royal. So we don't have exactly a, ironclad evidence about what went on there, but there seemed to be some connection between those two things. Anyway, when I was just asking a question about Indigenous star knowledge at an event in 2019 and asking whether Indigenous star knowledge should be used in the astronomy curriculum or in the anthropology curriculum, because you would be just studying what Indigenous people thought about the stars. Weasel had claimed that this was racist and discriminatory and should not be allowed to be expressed. And because I was using this as an example in a meeting, I got attacked by a number of faculty members, and that was added on to my termination letter, that I had disrupted this meeting so much that I wouldn't be able to, my employment relationship with Mount Royal was unviable. And I've done a documentary on that called Mount Royal University Murders Academic Freedom, which goes through the entire sequence of events that happened with respect to that meeting. Anyway, indigenization, which is accepting the beliefs of Indigenous people as being their truth and therefore cannot be challenged, is what is behind the Kamloops case and the discussion about the unmarked graves. And what happens is that if there's what's called knowledge keepers believe that there are bodies buried in the Kamloops apple orchard, you must affirm that that's true. Otherwise, you'll be, castigated in various ways. People will complain about you, and you will no longer be able to work at a university. So this unmarked graves area is a major kind of problem of not being able to work together to find out whether that's actually true or not. And the only way that's going to happen is with excavations, not with the sort of the stories that are being told that, could be true, but that's not definitive, because often you have stories which are told which turn out not to be true. And we found this out in the case of Pine Creek, where it was maintained that there were bodies buried in the basement of this church. And then excavations were done and just found rocks in the basement of that church. So that's the kind of situation that we're dealing with in the universities. And I would argue that because the universities have not really lived up to their Enlightenment values, this has percolated into all sorts of areas with respect to the discussion of the unmarked grave situation across the country. And then finally, we have the Middle East conflict, which I think is a very difficult area in universities now, because there's very, very high emotions on this subject. And I'm a board member for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, and we hear about these cases on both sides of this conflict. I don't want to stress one or the other, because we had a professor from Guelph who was criticizing Hamas. He was prevented from teaching at that university. And then, sorry, it's probably not Guelph, it's another Ontario university. And then we have the serious attempts to clamp down on people who are pro-Palestinian and criticizing Israel. And this is a particularly interesting area from an academic freedom perspective, because, as I mentioned, you will get a lot of support if you're criticizing trans activism and indigenization from a certain group of people who claim to support academic freedom. And those same people will then demand that someone who's saying some very outrageous thing about Israel, that they should be removed. So there's not a lot of consistency on the sort of what would be called the anti-woke side, and then the pro-Palestinian or the the criticisms of Israel side. So one of my main kinds of goals in the academic freedom fight is you've got to support everyone, everyone's ability to dissent and to criticize and to say sometimes outrageous things that we don't like. It can't just be those things that are aligned with the political position that people have. So I think that's why that one is interesting. And the famous case in the United States with respect to the pro-Palestinian kind of side, or the criticism of Israel, is the case of Norman Finkelstein, who was at DePaul University, who was a very, very distinguished scholar, an incredible teacher, who was not given tenure at DePaul University because of his book, The Holocaust Industry. And that is something that I think is a book that should be discussed in the university. And I don't think that your job should be threatened because you want to have arguments about that. Okay, so political implications. And this is, the importance of knowledge, arguing against the idea that universities are, separated from real world concerns. What we develop as knowledge in the universities, that knowledge has an impact on policy development, because when we're trying to solve problems, We need to understand what the causes of those problems are. And that's not happening very much in the universities in a number of different areas. And just with respect to those three examples that I was talking about in the last slide, the trans activism types of effects that are on the university. This is a massive scandal that is unfolding now, that we are only beginning to really understand the real impact of. And Mia Hughes, who I've had been fortunate enough to talk to on my podcast, is just an amazing researcher. She produced a report called the WPATH Files, which was a criticism of one of the major organizations that provided the expertise for what was called transgender medicine. And that organization has been completely taken over by activists, transgender activists. And so the kind of scientific research that was being done was seriously flawed. And that has led us to not have a very good understanding of the impact of puberty blockers and these surgeries and hormone use and so on. So this is a very good example of when you knock out the ability of professors to talk about trans issues in the universities, which seriously has happened. Don't be surprised when you have this, serious malpractice, which is unfolding with respect to especially young people, but people who are having irreversible changes made with quite serious consequences. Indigenous, the Aboriginal population, I've heard definitely in British Columbia, but maybe across the board in the last number of years, the life expectancy has dropped by, I believe, 10 years for the Aboriginal population. Maybe that's a bit high, but it's a significant reduction in life expectancy. Why is that Why is this occurring? In order to try to improve conditions, we need to be able to freely investigate what's occurring in Aboriginal communities. And that's not possible in the current, when the truth, the Enlightenment values of pursuing the truth have been knocked out. And the fetal alcohol syndrome problem in isolated Aboriginal communities is a topic, for example, that you cannot discuss. And we need to figure out what's happening there so that we can address the terrible suffering that exists in Aboriginal communities, which is not happening. And then finally, in terms of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, there's the question of what constitutes genocide. And this is something which I'm particularly interested in because the residential schools, it's argued that they were genocidal. That's an argument that's made by, well, we're told that it's a consensus of historians. And if you deny that, you're accused of residential school denialism. And that there's a MP from Winnipeg Center, whose name is Leah Gazan, who put forth a bill in 2024 trying to make that illegal. And that raises the question of, what actually is a genocidal action by a state. The Holocaust is an area that, I think it's not a very, there's a fringe element that might argue that that's not genocide, but I think we have very well documented cases. And that is something that when you compare the residential schools to the Holocaust, I think that is a hard comparison to make. And it seems to be much more contested, the idea of residential schools being genocidal than, the acceptance of the Holocaust being a genocide. But the area now, which is going to be very, very difficult to discuss, in addition to the residential schools, is the case of Gaza. And I know a number of academics who would argue that the case of Gaza is one of genocide, according to the Genocide Convention, which has 5 criteria. But because of the fraught character and the inability of universities to really protect the pursuit of truth within their institution, I think that's another example of where, if professors would be very reluctant to enter into this discussion, to hold an event on this, to examine it, to try to dispute it. And that doesn't mean that one would have to agree that that's the case. It's just that would we, in the current state that we're in, with the threat to the pursuit of truth that we are seeing, would you be able to actually even discuss that in a university setting? So just to make a plea for the Enlightenment, which I think we're all on board with, is we need to, being an Enlightenment thinker, being a person who espouses the values of the Enlightenment, we need to argue for the pursuit of truth in all its forms, because, this is sort of the John Stuart Mill position. Even if you think something is wrong and untrue, it's possible that it has some true aspects that could shed light on other matters. But also, even if an idea is false, it's important to discuss that idea because it enables us to have a better understanding of why an idea is true, and it doesn't just become dead dogma. And so I think I'll leave it there, and then we can get into some questions if people would like to ask questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Frances, for this presentation. I'm sure there's going to be questions, and I'm going to start off with one. And I want to say I appreciated your presentation, the part where you linked wokeism, the modern phenomena that we've been talking about quite a bit about, and earlier attempts to attack the Enlightenment, conservative religiosity, conservative religion, for example, and ethnic nationalism and romanticism. And so as you know, my field, I studied the self, and I have taken a look at individualism and collectivism within the self of individuals, and that there's a certain tension between the two. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this attack on the Enlightenment. It was an attack on the idea that the individual can discern truth, that there is such a thing as truth, and that it can be attained through science and reason, and the truth is not something that is delivered from on high, as it were. I'm wondering if wokeism then could be seen as another manifestation of that tension, that attempt to restrict the rights of the individual to, as you've adequately put it, go speak their own mind and go their own way.
Definitely, I would see it that way. I think that the wokeism, which is, as I've said, is not a pejorative. It's a phenomenon about identity politics that has become totalitarian. It is the identity of groups that are perceived to be oppressed, which are the important things to protect, and therefore the individual is really not a important category, and is almost seen as a threat, I would argue. And that's why, you see people individuals being pushed out of the university, is because in some instances, there's other reasons too, but this is one of the things which is happening, which is if your attempts to reason are a threat to a group that is perceived to be oppressed view of itself, that will be not allowed in the university, because it's the pursuit of truth is not the overarching value. in the universities anymore. It is equity, diversity, and inclusion. That's a higher value in many universities. And so if you say something which is upsetting to a member of one of these groups, and they claim that they can't function in this environment because being criticized denies their humanity, then that's something that is going to happen. So I think that it is an attack on the individual. Definitely, it's also an attack, and I'm not sure how much the Enlightenment had to do this, but a lot of this is an attack on merit, the merit principle. It would be interesting to kind of look at the Enlightenment as to what their position is on the merit principle and the idea that you should have excellence in various endeavors. But that's another factor. But certainly the individual and the ability of the individual to criticize protected groups is a major aspect of wokeism that is a threat.
Thank you, Frances. Are there other questions? Other people want to talk?
I have a question. In your presentation, you mentioned very briefly capitalism. And I think that if there's one barrier to enlightenment, it's there. The thing is that I really don't know what to replace it with. But I think that you could argue, that we're actually living in an oligarchy. The various governments, and not just here, but other places. I'm talking about the U.S., but also, all over Europe. They're under the pressure of big company who, because of the means that they have, are able to dictate to the government, to pass law, not to really interfere with their business. And, and this is, to me, this is sort of, I'm trying to think of the right word, but anyway, it's not a nice word. But like I said, I don't know what to replace it other than, we all grab, torches and pitchforks and march on government or big company. But it seems to me strongly inhuman, the race for more profit. I mean, more is never enough. So and that human needs and human social partnership is getting, squashed. So I mean, there's so much wrong with our society when you look at people, in the streets. I don't know how is it in the other provinces, but here in Quebec, there's a serious shortage of affordable lodging. Okay, and and the reason for that is that it's all in the hand of promoters. And when a promoter build, a 6-story condo, it's not affordable to, somebody who works at the basic salaries, So anyway, that's it. It's only a little thing, but how could we try? How could we react to that as a humanist, other than saying, well, it should be like this, but they can say,
Yeah.
that's it. But to me, that's one big hurdle for human values. Human values are very, very, very low in the large companies and the Teslas of this world.
And I guess the question is it capitalism itself, or is it a particular kind of capitalism that's the problem? And some some would argue, and I personally, because I'm a Orwellian socialist, I think socialism is a better system than capitalism. But at the same time, I see serious dangers as to what's happened historically in trying to bring about socialist systems. Like it does seem to be a chronic problem of bureaucracies and control over bureaucracies by a kind of a bureaucratic class, and then the inability of the population, because of the clamp down on democratic processes that often occur, to fight back against that. Is that just because of those particular periods in human history where the population wasn't developed enough to be able to have the strength of, you know, counterbalances that would stop that from happening? Or is there something in, you know, the way humans operate which always lead to the corrosion of these kinds of systems? So, you know, it's like and just on what do you replace it with, that kind of comment, it sort of reminds me of the Winston Churchill, you know, kind of statement about democracy, that, you know, democracy is the worst system that's ever existed except for all the others, you know, that kind of idea. And I think I don't think that about, I just think it's kind of one of those questions which, you know, when we, like capitalism, because of its the market principle, and that's another interesting question, is that can you have markets in a socialist kind of framework? Is that possible? Or do you always have to have what's called a command economy in a socialist system, where you have, it's the state that determines what's going to be produced and how it's going to be distributed? And if you were to have a socialist system which had a market principle, whereby you had a bit more flexible, you know, kind of like a line of responsiveness, like that's kind of the thing, is that when you have these kind of command economies, you have a group that's controlling things, and then they tend to take over that and use it to enrich themselves and their associates, you know. So these are kind of very, you know, I realize the complexity of these problems, but I think what I notice a lot is people don't see, like they see capitalism as being just at a heart, you know, in its deep down, it's kind of a beneficial system. And I don't see that myself. I see, because of the profit motive, because of the ownership situation, that, you know, you have, and I'm not talking about ownership in the sense of, you know, I own this scarf and it's my personal thing or whatever. It's, you know, ownership of what's called the means of production. So the factories, the things that produce things that people need to be able to survive, you know, like that, and now that's owned by someone. So now, in order to get the things that you need to survive, you're going to have to have enough money to pay for those things. And if you don't have enough money to pay for those things, you're not going to be able to get the things that you need to survive. And, you know, I think that where we see this most clearly now is, you know, the pharmaceutical companies and the huge wealth that's being generated by the pharmaceutical companies, and people who need those drugs to survive, who can't afford them, and all these kinds of issues. You know, this seems to me to be a massive thing that prevents people from being able to, you know, live, you know, the kind of the idea of the goal of the Enlightenment, which was to provide the best system possible for humanity. It's an obstacle. It seems to be an obstacle to that. Yeah, but we could potentially say that we now produce enough. Like we produce enough for everyone now. Like
Yes.
we have, like one could argue that we have overproduction. Like we're drowning in our own waste. You know, like this is, we're not careful about our resources. We're just and we're producing all these things which are not only useless, they're actually harmful for people, like all sorts of things. So I think it's now a question of you know, distribution and producing things which are actually beneficial to people, to humanity, But in capitalism, that's not really at this stage. And capitalism as well, the other interesting thing about it is that there's been a number of stages of capitalism where you have sort of capitalism on its upward trajectory and capitalism on its downward trajectory, if we're going to see it that way. On the upward trajectory, it was actually producing things which offered great advantages and improvements for people. And now we have, obsolescence built into products so that you'll have to buy a new thing even if you don't need it. You have all these, profit making schemes because of the fact that we're kind of exhausting that kind of innovative kind of thing that was happening. Not to mention, like spending all this money on outer space, which, I don't know how people feel about this, but I think this is just madness. That, here we have all these problems that we got to deal with, and we're having Elon Musk talk about, having a civilization of 1 million people on Mars. I think that just is absolutely just, there's just no way that can happen. Like with the, you're going to have to take everything from here and travel, several years to build a new place, which is inhospitable to humans. Shouldn't we be working on how to solve our environmental crisis here so that we can have a hospitable environment in an actual place where, you have oxygen and trees and, you can survive without a dome to protect you from the elements here, that kind of thing. This is sort of stuff which is obviously hyper capitalistic kind of profit seeking activity.
I'm learning so much. Thank you, Frances. And I'm really a lay person here, and it's very informative. Before, I have a couple of comments and one quick question, but I'm going to slip in another comment. You were talking about going to space and Mars. I agree with you. It's folly, and we when I say we, it was one of our humanist groups. It might have been the Center for Inquiry. We had a NASA scientist, Caroline Porco, Dr. Porco. She talked about this. She's a leading engineer at NASA, and she said Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, they call her. She led some, mission to, I forget it was Saturn or Jupiter. Anyhow, she said, listen, you guys, please use your money and your leadership and your organizational abilities to clean up exactly what you said, Frances, here on Earth. Do something, for example, remove the greenhouse gases from our atmosphere. Like, forget going to Mars. She thought it was just folly, but she said, these guys don't listen to me. So anyhow, so now back to today's topic. Yeah. Just a small point when you mentioned 3 revolutions as, I liked your term, precursors or events that was sort of, I'm sure history is slow and progress is slow. And you mentioned 3 revolutions. What I thought of was the Copernican revolution, where, pardon me?
The scientific revolution.
The scientific revolution, thank you, yes. And so I'm more asking the question than stating this, because I'll defer to the rest of you, but is it not true that with every scientific advance, it sort of weakened the hold of dogma, whether it's religious dogma or any dogma? If we learned things based on evidence, I'm thinking that helped as a precursor change in society towards this Enlightenment period we're talking about. Anyhow, but as you said, all these Enlightenment thinkers were not atheists, and I'm sure we all agree with that. Many were probably deists. I like the word free thinkers, although people living, in that time probably did not use the term, but in our humanist communities now, we describe free thinkers as people who, base their answers or look at questions based on reason, evidence, and so on, science, not on tradition, authority, and dogma. So these free thinkers which is an essential part of science. So I'm getting to my question then. Scientists don't really have to believe anything. The way I like to present it is that scientists, they don't just have beliefs, but they point to what is most likely to be true based on the evidence, and they're willing to change their ideas based on new information. So this idea of humility, and this is really my question: would you say humility is an Enlightenment value?
I guess it's sort of a qualified humility. Like it's humility in the sense that, as you say, you're willing to change your mind if the evidence presents itself,
Yes.
but not humility in the sense that you're willing to defer to ideas that are not supported by evidence. This sort of thing. It's like, an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out. Or I think that's Carl Sagan's comment.
Yeah.
So it's like you don't want to be dogmatic
No.
yourself,
Yeah.
but at the same time, you have a foundation of evidence which has led you to think it's highly probable that
Yeah.
this is going to be the case. So you're not going to be just listening to anything anyone says. You've already kind of formed your view based upon the evidence already. So it's kind of like, I guess it's kind of a qualified humility.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
That'd be my best answer.
Okay.
Anybody else have questions?
Well, I have one that kind of follows on Glenn's last question. Frances, are you familiar with critical trade theory?
Critical trade theory. Nope, I'm not.
Well, that is a theory that all trade that is unequal is exploitative. And we can tell who's exploiting who by calculating the amount of trade going both ways. Thus, the islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon sold over $200,000 worth of fish. This is US dollars, not Canadian, to the United States while importing only $10,000. Obviously, Saint Pierre and Miquelon are exploiting the United States and are fully deserving of the 50% tariff Mr. Trump placed on them. Now, I'm obviously doing a parody here, aren't I? But it flows from the idea of wokeism not being a specific ideology, but a way of thinking. Is there a woke right as well as a woke left?
Yeah, Andrew Doyle actually was talking about this. So it would be, so if we are defining wokeism as the totalitarian identity politics and affirming the identities that are believed to be oppressed through these authoritarian means, then you could have, well, for example, white nationalism could be that way. Like if it's people who identify as white, who see themselves as being oppressed and want there to be totalitarian pressures against those that are, denying their identities and so on. So it's that's possible that would be. I'm trying to think of what Andrew Doyle was saying the woke right was. I don't remember. I listened to that podcast, but I don't remember. But that would be, I guess it would be identities that are not really oppressed, but perceive themselves as being oppressed. So
Well, now that has a problem with objectification. How do we determine who's oppressed and who's not objectively? And I guess there's various measures we can do. But what I was alluding to is that if we view wokeism in large part to be a function of postmodernism, then Mr. Trump has been creating his own realities and his own rules, and what he does is consistent within, and not Trump, just Trump. It's the Trumpists generally. What they believe is consistent with the rules that they set, and it's similar to what we see with regard to, say, critical race theory, where we saw a commissioner of the RCMP have to apologize and reverse. In a humiliating apology, she had to reverse her position that she had taken a look at the RCMP procedures and didn't see and policies and didn't see any evidence of systemic racism. And then the next day she had to reverse her course because, of course, the RCMP arrest more people of color, particularly Indigenous people, than not Indigenous, and therefore, without having to look further, we can just say that, okay, there's racism here, or in the case of Pierre Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, they're obviously exploiting the United States. You don't have to look further. The evidence is there before you.
Sorry, I just, in terms of your question, it is about was it right-wing wokeism?
Yeah, that is a system of thinking of absolutism that takes a. You see, the reason why postmodernism was failing in universities at one point was because it was unstable and it requires a belief system. And so a belief system could be manufactured. That's where our race wokeism came from, I think. And in a sense, I think the Trumpists are reflecting the same kind of thought patterns, but from a different, they're setting up a different system of rules.
Yes. And this is something that I've been working on for a number of years, which is this weird shift that happened between the denial of truth and the relativistic position that was in the 60s, which is generally referred to as postmodernism. And then the diversity, equity, diversity, inclusion, which I think is a combination of wokeism and social equity, the kind of the dogmatism of that. So that's not relativistic. Like you're not told that, the trans person with their whatever has their truth, and you, as being someone who insists on the biology of sex, as having your truth. That's not what's going on. It's like you, the person who's saying that there's a biological character to men and women, you shut up. And if you insist on saying that, you're gonna have all these things happen to you. So how does that happen? Where you have that, they seem to be part of the same continuum, but they're completely at odds with one another in the sense of one being relativistic and the other being dogmatic. That's kind of the situation. And I would argue that I don't think wokeism is postmodern at all. I think it's authoritarian, but the postmodernist assault on truth, which happened in the 60s, paved the way and created the fertile soil for the authoritarianism that we're now beginning to, not beginning, that's been unfolding since, I guess, around 2013, 2014. That's when we saw things become authoritarian. And in the university system, what happened was the postmodernism, the assault on truth, allowed the activist programs to gain a foothold in the universities through these, what James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and Boghossian called the grievance studies programs. So Black studies, women's studies, etc., queer studies. They got a position. Like they wouldn't, before the 60s, they would have never obtained a position, like some kind of foothold, because people would have said, no, you don't have the evidence-based scholarship to have a place in the university. You might have had the odd theorist, but you wouldn't have had the institutionalization of it. But when that happened, it allowed those activists to gain control over the machinery, because that's what they do, right? They spend all their time engaged in activist kinds of activities in the university, and eventually they take over the machinery of the university, and then you build in equity, diversity, and inclusion centers, and now they're sending out memos telling you that you got to have territorial land acknowledgements on your syllabus, and these, like, they're doing this all the time. Like soon you're going to have pronouns on your email signature. Like people are already asking, why don't you have pronouns on your email signature? Like what's wrong with you? Or like you get like this kind of thing. Soon it's going to be like, well, if you know what's good for you, you're going to do it, this kind of thing. Anyway, that was all done through the taking over of the machinery of these institutions, which was made possible by the assault on truth that happened in the 1960s. So I see postmodernism as being a separate thing than the wokeism and the EDI, the equity, diversity, inclusion. And I don't find them to be consistent, because one's dogmatic and one is, relativistic.
Frances, I think I want to jump in with a quick comment, because I think there's a theme that we haven't really, we've touched upon obliquely, but not actually directly, which has to do with aspects of cultural Marxism and the way in which a power dynamic exists from a Marxist perspective. That there is a power dynamic of oppressor and oppressed. And there are victims who are quote unquote marginalized, and there is a race to the bottom as to who is the most victimized or who is the most marginalized, because in this inverted world, their opinions and their perspective of truth wins out. And so the idea then of oppression and power differential in Marxism drives a lot of this basically critical theory that drives a lot of this postmodern thought. And the difficulty that I certainly have with respect to this is that is not that people are arguing from this cultural Marxist perspective of oppressor versus oppressed. It's that the structure of oppression is quite fine, thank you very much. Those who are quote unquote victimized, intersectional whatever, are quite happy with the oppression. It's just who's the one who's being oppressed that they want to address. They want this oppression to continue, only in an inverted way. And so there is essentially a reinforcement of these cultural Marxist ideas. And so how do you address a person who believes that what you, as you said, is driven by a sense of compassion? There's a YouTuber out there who refers to it as feel sorry forism. He's like, I'm doing it because I feel sorry for the victims, and there is this aspect of it which drives it. It's sort of like morally driven, puritanically. So how do you on a one-on-one basis interact with somebody who has bought into these ideas deeply, has these perspectives? How do you bridge that divide and get them to reevaluate.
Well, there's a couple of things that I was going to say in response to it. The first is the question of Marxism and what's the relationship between wokeism and Marxism, and I would argue that it's actually a movement. It began with Herbert Marcuse, who, is part of the Frankfurt
Right.
School.
Frankfurt School, yes.
And he gave up on the working class. So that was his. He said the working class are too satisfied in America. They've got, they have a boat in their backyard because they're making all these high salaries at General Motors, and therefore it's not going to be them who's going to bring about the revolution. It's going to be the ghetto, what he called the ghetto populations, and
Right.
that to not Marxism is a class-based theory, economic, labor theory, value, class.
That's right. That's traditional Marxism. What we're talking about is conversion from bourgeoisie and proletariat in economic terms to cultural Marxism. That's based on race and gender dynamics, where there's there's still a class differential, but it's now converted into this gender and race concept.
Yeah, but it doesn't have the same. It's like XY sperm producing people calling themselves women. Like Marxism is a theory about the economic character of the capitalist system and the exploitation of labor, and so it has a lot of elements to it which were just thrown asunder by Marcuse.
Yeah.
So it's not really the same thing that we're talking about, although it was useful in that people who originally had some sympathy for Marxism kind of were thought they're going to continue on the same pathway, but they're now diverted into something that is
That's
really
right.
not the same thing. So I think
It's
it was
not-
kind of a language game that was played, and I don't think people should go along with that misuse of language, which I think and of course people like James Lindsay, who is a rabid anti-communist, which is he sees it everywhere, and I have a great respect for James Lindsay in terms of many of the things that he is arguing, and find much of what he talks about is very helpful, but I don't find his insistence on seeing everything to do with wokeism as Marxism as accurate. And if we're going to accurately portray the theory historical materialism, we would have the economic theory about the exploitation of labor and so on, and that would have to be, and that's not, you cannot just graft race and gender and sexual orientation and trans and all this, that's not really, it doesn't fit with that economic theory. So that's the first thing.
So just to clarify, let's not call it Marxism if you're going to say that Marxism is inextricably linked to an economic system.
Yes, I would.
So then it's not Marxism. You want to call it neo-Marxism or post-Marxism,
I would call it
son of Marxism, whatever.
I call it Marcusianism myself.
Marcusian Marxism, whatever.
I would just say Marcuse, was a person who was authoritarian, and he wanted to have a theory that would help him to assert power in the current circumstances in the United States in which he found himself in. So that was sort of the nature of that. But when you're talking about compassion, which is what wokeism does, or Marcusianism, I guess probably it's rooted in there. One thing is you have to, first of all, I think people seeing themselves as victims is not beneficial to even to them. Like this will not, for someone to be encouraged to see themselves as a victim, that is not the path to empowerment. So that's kind of that's got to kind of got to be exposed. And then as well, the manipulation, like the cry, like the best one is these kinds of bullying that's going on. And I've seen that so many times where here's someone who's trying to get you fired and so on, do all these things, and is just absolutely toxic person. And as soon as you just like satirize their efforts to try to get you fired, they turn around and start screaming about how you're oppressing them, and this is, you don't feel safe and all. So that kind of maneuver has got to be exposed. But I think there's kind of the dual side of that. One is being a victim isn't, as a way of being a victim is not the path to empowerment. That's not gonna, what the path to empowerment is organizing with other people and fighting for what's going to enable you to be a contributing member of society. If you're being denied that opportunity, which is, sometimes this is wound up with it. You do have justified kinds of grievances, but you can't just wallow in your victimhood and demand compensation. That's usually what it's related to too, is demanding compensation on the basis of one's victim status. That just makes you a prostitute. You have to band together with others to organize, to fight for your ability to have equal opportunity in the society. So I think there's a lot of manipulation that's going on that has got to be faced head on, and people have got to have the courage to do it. And it's not easy because you're accused of all sorts of horrible things. But if you can kind of just develop a tough skin and say, to hell with you, I'm going to go ahead anyway.
My last comment there is that all these days, apparently all a person needs to do is say, I'm a victim and I feel unsafe. And apparently that's a drop down you can't respond to this argument. It's kind of like bulletproof. Oh, I feel unsafe, and that's it.
Well, the safety, like it's the language again. George Orwell, and if I can just praise him again, he understood this kind of stuff. And it was like the politics of the English language. And, we need to have clarity in our language so that we can think clearly. And this is the big thing that postmodernism was is so into, was confusing everything all the time. So everyone is just kind of in this constant state of confusion. So we're not able to properly understand what's happening. And this whole thing about safety, it's just, safety is a freedom from physical threat. It's not freedom from someone criticizing like that, but that's been done. And it's really a very insulting way of thinking about, whichever group that these people are trying to protect, because it's saying that they're so fragile and they're so weak that, saying the book title White Niggers of America has these catastrophic consequences. It's like, no, it doesn't. Everyone knows there's a difference between quoting a book title and calling someone a racial slur. Everyone knows this. The people who are reacting in the way that they are cry bullies who are trying to get some kind of advantage over other people and so on. And that should just be, but you have to fight it. Like you have to, like, as I am now, is that I will not have people censor that book title. That is ridiculous.
So we have another question here from Scott.
Hello. So one thing I'm getting from folks is there's okay. So a little backdrop. There's a whole category of alternate religions, in quotes, called parody religions. And so we've all heard of like the Pink Unicorn, the Flying Spaghetti Monster, Church of the Subgenius, Discordianism is another one. There's a guy named Reverend Ivan Stang, not his actual name. I think after 30 years or so, he retired. I did an interview with him many, many years ago. And one thing he said in another interview that struck me was we found out while he was a reverend in quotes in the Church of the Subgenius, the hard way was that there's not anything you can't say that someone somewhere won't believe it. And so this kind of stuff sort of pops up. I think humor is very important. So I think it was from Discordianism. It was a concept for those, is a metaphorical affliction for people who have rejected spontaneity and joy, called the curse of gray face. Do you find that those who are afflicted in terms of seeing you as the embodiment of all evil, that they are in fact they are suffering from the curse of gray face? That's all.
Yeah, well, humorlessness. This is what got me. See, I just can't take it seriously often, and I've got to satirize. I think satire is one of the ways forward. Like this ties in with what Robert was saying, is that satire is a great weapon. Humor is a great weapon in these crazy times, but the problem is that it often has catastrophic consequences, and that was my downfall, is that I just could not take Gabrielle Weaselhead seriously. Like this was just a ridiculous thing she was doing, and the more she would try to go after me, the more I would just kind of satirize her attempts to get me fired. But in the end, that's what kind of was, if I just backed off and not done that, like, I don't know, I guess the end would have come at some point anyway. It just came more quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I find the lack of humor is one of the most kind of really annoying things about all of this stuff. That it takes itself so seriously that, but is it what is the name of that religion?
It's called Discordianism.
Discordianism.
It's a whole category of parody religions, sort of, or satirical religions,
the curse of the gray face.
The curse of gray face. This satirical religion was founded in the 1950s. So we're talking, we're talking the time of like Lenny Bruce and Paul Krasner and the Realist and all that stuff. So it was around that same time.
How do you spell it?
The Curse of Gray Face or Discordianism?
Well, I know how to spell curse and face.
I don't know. So Discordianism, Discord, and then IANISM. I can give a quick. So it's the religion worships Ares, the Greek goddess of chaos, discord, and embraces absurdity, contradiction, and paradox as essential elements of the world. And the remedy for the curse of gray face apparently is to embrace chaos, playfulness, and creative disorder to break the spell cast by gray face.
But gray face is that sort of seen as a religion? Is that gray face is a religion? Is that kind of how they're seeing?
It's the curse.
No. Yeah, the curse of gray face is the curse by gray face, but I don't think gray face is a categorical antipode of the embodiment of everything that they don't represent. Yeah. Right. So, so I don't think gray face represents a dull conformity necessarily, but it's a curse
but you could potentially, I just thought you could potentially defend yourself from these harassment allegations and everything by calling yourself a Discordianist, like a practitioner of Discordianism.
I mean, you probably could do that. I mean, I had to drop out for 45 minutes to do an interview, so I apologize for that. But I did an interview, 2 interviews recently, where I brought up something that Richard Dawkins had done, or someone had recommended to Dawkins, and then he did. So it's one feminist Argentinian economist talking about this Malay regime, and then also another one who does women on web, sort of like does abortion sort of education and stuff. And they get hate mail, as you might imagine. And so one of the ones, this lady, Veni L. Ciarua, who runs Women on Web as executive director, she noted that in her emails, basically, she would have regular work email, and then subject heading would be "burn in hell," and then regular work email. And the Argentinian, the same thing. And so I brought up to both of them that Richard Dawkins actually had taken a bunch of his hate mail and read it out as comedy. And a lot of them had misspellings, poor logic, and so they were sort of self-caricaturing in their attacks on Richard Dawkins, a lot of ad hominem stuff. And so he read those out by a fireplace, if I recall correctly. Others who know that story better will know. And so I found it quite funny. But I recommended them, you take your hate mail and you invert it, and then on your website you have like a whole web page that's just endorsements, and then you have burn in hell and so on and so forth. Do you think that could be helpful? If not for your cause, at least for your sort of own well-being, just to laugh at the stuff.
Yes. Oh, I think so. I think that you have to laugh at it, like you really do. And it's helpful. And it's much better to go out and that, even if it is catastrophic. It's better psychologically. Like they're going to take, that's kind of my own take on my own situation, is that, I was going to get taken down at some point, but I kind of did it in a blaze of, I never compromised I never did. I went through like a struggle session with the provost, and I would not give in on anything. And I never, apologized for anything or accept a responsibility or showed remorse or anything. And it was better. It's better from my own psychological stance. So I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, is find a way to make fun of things, to find the humor in the darkness.
Dan seems to have his hand up there.
Thank you for your words of wisdom and encouragement, and the advice that we take. Don't take our cause seriously, but take ourselves lightly. Thank you. Robert has told us all that we have run out of time. So Robert, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I just want to thank everybody for and first of all, thank Frances for a wonderful talk, and I think it's very enlightening on the Enlightenment, and I think that there is much to do going forward. We've had a number of different questions that had come to this meeting regarding the growth of the New Enlightenment Project and how we can go forward. I think I would like to leave everyone with a thought to ask a friend to join the New Enlightenment Project, and as we move forward on various aspects of how to address this large issue related to trends in DEI, wokeism, and Enlightenment values, pursuit of Enlightenment values. So thanks everybody for coming today. And with that, Lloyd, we have other content which is coming out, going to be released on our website in terms of podcast materials and things. So it's a question of sort of staying tuned to our NEP website and our social media channels that we have. And there you go. Any other final thoughts?
Well, I think we were going to have a group discussion, and I perceive that we've taken our time. I'm going to suggest that the new board will schedule a meeting, and that we schedule a members meeting at some point down the road to continue this discussion.
Great. I think everybody would enjoy that, right?
Very much.
Yep.
Okay. So with that, I think we can close the meeting. And thanks everybody for coming. And we'll stay tuned for an announcement for that members discussion. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thanks very much. Nice meeting you.
Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.